Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual annual meeting for the Society of French Historical Studies and the George Rudé meeting for the panel 18. My name is Mita Choudhury, and I teach history and women's studies at Vassar College. And panel 18 today is the political and religious philosophy in the Enlightenment. And our format will be the following. Each of the panelists who submitted, who gave presentations that are available on YouTube will briefly introduce themselves. And from there, we will start having a conversation about the papers. So next up is Geoff Burson.
Thank you, Mita. I'm Geoff Burson. I'm, as of August anyway, professor of French history at Georgia Southern University. Typically, I research the French Enlightenment and teach a variety of courses related to that in the Revolutionary era. And I'm specifically most interested and have published most widely on the intersection of religion and the Enlightenment, in particular, Enlightenment Catholicism.
Rebecca, you're next.
Yes, Rebecca Kingston. I'm professor of political science at the University of Toronto. So I teach a variety of courses in political theory. Currently, as my presentation suggests, I'm writing a monograph in the history of political thought on Plutarch reception in French and English traditions from 1500 to 1800.
And Geoff.
I'm Geoff Kemp. I'm a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Auckland, so welcome to Auckland. I don't directly work on French history usually. I work on, I have one foot in the 21st century teaching politics and media, and I have a foot more in the 17th century looking at history of political thought, particularly John Locke at the moment, also book history and publishing history. So late 17th and early 18th century.
Okay, well, welcome to all of you. So as a starter, just before we started recording, we were having a humorous discussion about the title of this panel and how things were not fitting. And while we all know that to some extent that panel titles are kind of made up, thrown in the wind, it's a little bit like throwing spaghetti on the wall. I think actually this is a rich opportunity because to think about how, after papers have been submitted and read, how you could retitle us. You know, what are the elements that bring these papers together? And from my end, what I thought about after having read all three papers is thinking about the different ways in which ideas are transmitted, the ways in which ideas and texts transform, you know, so it's a question of circulation, transformation, and really thinking about, and you know, I'm eager to hear what you have to say about how does it help us think about history synchronically, diachronically, periodization, geography, and challenge us as historians. So I will leave you with this broad question just as a kind of starting point. So go ahead, and I will be looking at raised sort of fingers and so forth to kind of start it going. So.
I guess I'll take a stab at it. To some extent, I think these papers, while they are certainly diverse in many ways and don't directly address one another specifically, they're also interdisciplinary, which I think is a strength of this particular panel too, which I find fascinating. They do sort of suggest possible ways in which the early modern period as a whole speaks to itself. And by that, I mean basically looking, as my work does, at some of the long-range origins of Enlightenment and its diverse manifestations back to even the 16th century, and looking for the roots of it somewhat more deeply, somewhat more broadly, in religious discourses as well as political thought and moving it further on beyond that. And I do think that to a great extent, the work that Geoff Kemp has done in his fine paper, it sort of poses some interesting questions about those chance connections that, major figures such as John Locke, certainly of the early Enlightenment as conventionally defined, might really have come across some of his reading materials. I'd be interested in hearing more about that. And, Dr. Kingston, Professor Kingston's paper in looking at the way in which chose publique derives from res publica in the translations of Plutarch in the early 16th centuries, it does sort of speak to this issue of how notions of public good and political thought from the 16th century might actually inform the rise of Republican discourses even as late into the 18th century. So I suppose to wrap all of that up, I might hazard a summary of suggesting perhaps translations of thought and circulations of political and religious notions from the 16th century to the 18th century.
Okay, great.
Well, perhaps if I mean, just looking at the title that we do have, it's quite interesting, really, because, as you say, conference organisers put together programs, and it's probably a study in itself to think about what preconceptions we have about certain names. And I can imagine that I mentioned the name John Locke, and political philosophy seems, the slot to kind of put him in. And so I think it is interesting. And one thing maybe that I want to do with my paper is almost stress the insignificance of some encounters in terms of kind of traditional areas of preoccupation with, say, somebody like John Locke. I mean, here's somebody who's, so famous for writing on toleration, so famous for as a political philosopher. He's in France in the 1670s. He goes to La Rochelle. He meets a local Calvinist who, and they have some kind of encounter. And of course, the assumption would be, there's going to be something going on in their conversation or their exchange later that's really to do with questions about persecution of Protestants, to do with potential political repercussions. But in fact, these men, these women in the period were concerned with scholarship, and I suppose it's something that seems to bind the papers as well. That I think in Geoff's paper, he just points out that these people were scholars and interested in things like acquiring a language, as Locke was, to improve his French, and these kind of things are important to them. And of course, when you read, say, Locke's Locke's correspondence, his correspondence is all about acquiring the best translations of classical works, of working into the real detail of these, and really less, the kind of concerns that most people associate Locke with. So with that in mind, I can see why Locke goes in a section that talks about political philosophy, including in the Enlightenment, because he is an early Enlightenment political philosopher. But in a way, this encounter is pointing to those other dimensions of what he was about. I mean, as maybe as a coda to this, as I'm going on too long, really, but I did do a paper on Locke for a conference last year, and I entitled it. I just used a little theme that Locke picks up again, sort of classical trope, really, about the lesbian rule. The idea of shaping, or the idea of the builders of Lesbos, who had a flexible rule, and they'd shape the rule to the building rather than the building to the rule, and that this could apply. And Locke is accused of having a view of moral science that follows this, that in a way morality is shaped towards human desires rather than vice versa. Anyway, so I put lesbian rule in the title of the paper, and on the first cut, it got put into a gender sort of gender politics slot, or gender and sexuality politics slot, and it just tickled me really, the thought that it brings out what we actually conceive about certain thinkers and about certain areas of thought, whether it's the Enlightenment itself, that kind of shapes what we actually do as academics in terms of categorization and placement and titles and so on. So, sorry, I overextended my time.
Yeah. So I mean, the sort of two thoughts that occur to me in this relate to, origins as well as transformations. I mean, in terms of, it sort of occurred to me as people were speaking and thinking about my own contribution for the panel, is that, there's a sense in which we often think of the modern era as a sort of continuation or the legacy of the French Enlightenment in many ways, the sort of issuing in of modernity and so on. Yet, a sort of interesting feature is that many people we associate with that era were so, as Geoff Kemp was saying, right? We're so so highly versed, and sort of steeped in reading the classics, right? And classical historians and Plutarch, but also, a variety of other texts that Geoff showed in his presentation. And so, it raises the question about how the Enlightenment era might also be, what the effect of that reading was, and to what degree are we distant from the Enlightenment because of their, of those sorts of references being so strong in their minds and so strongly educating that class of 18th century public figures. But also in addition, right, if related to Geoff Burson's paper, very interesting paper, very thought-provoking about some of these religious sort of thought that led into a contemporary movement of secularization. And so then the question is, right, what does that say about, in terms of if we construe the narrative in that way, right, and if the origins come through this sort of circuitous path, right? What are the implications for understanding secular society today, or the description, the use of the term? To what extent do the origins matter, I guess, and to what extent do the cultural references that led certain thinkers to make certain arguments, right? That we have the arguments, but we no longer have the references, right? To what extent does the elucidation of that matter or not in our understanding of what that thought was and the implications of it?
Can I say one thing, and then just what it strikes me, Rebecca, from hearing you, is that what we don't have a full is we look back from a certain perspective, in search of the origins, and we're kind of and historians particularly, we think about change over time, and that actually imposes a certain kind of narrative. How did we in one way or another get from A to F, say, without it necessarily being linear, but we still want to know how we got there, right? And so that is a narrative that comes to us even before. And the other thing too is that because we're looking for something, we might not think about how people in this period are synthesizing different literature and emphasizing, such as the classics, that they don't, because we may think of Enlightenment as rupture, but they are not thinking in those terms, so they're drawing from texts that were important in the past.
Is it the other way though? Because I mean, in Geoff's paper, in a way, it's saying it's not a rupture, and my perception is that teaching it from teaching modern politics with a sort of historical bent, in a way, because it's usually done in a fairly short period of time, the sense is, that the Enlightenment is still kind of dominated by the view the Enlightenment's a kind of rupture. It's a kind of secularization process. I suppose one of my questions was, and this is coming from my own ignorance, which extends to much French history, but the Enlightenment literature generally. Geoff, your sense was that there's still that kind of dominant, the literature still dominant by that kind of perception that you were arguing against, to reinstate religious thought and theological concerns. And my sort of sense is that in a way that's moved on, and is it because of the dominance of sort of Jonathan Israel and the sort of radical Enlightenment thesis that in a way we've brought back that kind of secular Enlightenment as the dominant mode of talking about it, or has it just gone away?
Well, actually, if I could just jump in and try to adjust to address Geoff's question and maybe more indirectly think through Rebecca's very good question also. I'm not so much attempting to suggest that secularization is the dominant narrative, but I do think that you hit on something specific, which is to say that in the face of a lot of, certainly not confusion, but a diversity of interpretive modes for looking at the Enlightenment, there have been a kind of an attempt to restructure and revive a notion of a secular Enlightenment. And I'm thinking actually here more specifically of Margaret Jacobs' very good book, which is actually quite nuanced about this. I mean, she does not, I recently reviewed it, in any fundamental sense attempt to discount religious changes as causal or related, but that there is a kind of a rupture there. And I agree with her. I definitely agree that there is a rupture, but I do think that there's probably more work to be done across disciplines to historicize that rupture. I mean, there's certainly, from a variety of different perspectives in the current historiography and scholarship more generally, I think, a notion that something je ne sais quoi changes between the 1750s and 1770s. The political economy and moral discourses become somewhat more specific, and there are social transformations that map onto that, and transformations in the history of the book and so forth. I think there's also a kind of a late Enlightenment globalization of it, or at least I should say trans-European emergence of it. So there is a rupture, and there is, I think, something of an effort to simplify the complexity by speaking more specifically of secularization and looking at that. My work, and specifically what I was trying to get at in this paper, I think, is more just asking the question, is it just secularization or is it a new kind of secularization? And at the same time, sort of questioning whether we can't in fact look at secularization as the emergence of new forms of faith, imminent perhaps, oriented toward humane pursuits, but in other words, as opposed to conceptually assuming, as we so often do sort of casually in the classroom, I'm guilty of this myself, secularization as oppositional in a sense, and a rupture with religious and theological discourses, that we do in fact take a little bit more seriously when we describe it, a new form of theology. And that's what I was trying to suggest by my paper, and looking specifically at l'histoire croisée as a way of sort of refining that. Relatedly, yes, of course, there's such a religious turn to Enlightenment studies recently that I think that too has posed its complexities, and I'm not in any way trying to argue with a straw man that I think has been, at least among most scholars, questioned at least, and complicated over the years. I think we all agree on that factor. To Rebecca's question, it's a good point, and I'll try to be a little more brief here since I'm conscious of taking up too much airtime. The implications of this that made me question this as well. I think there is definitely something, as Mita suggested, to be said about reframing the origins to understand how it plays out in our contemporary moment. The extent of those implications I couldn't tell you, but it's a question I'd like to pursue in the future. And I also do believe that many things about the Enlightenment, its transformations, not just as an age of reason, perhaps also as an age of new and diversified kinds of religious experience and theological discourses, plenty of scholarship on that, may suggest something about the 19th century bridge between our moment and the 18th century. And so I can't answer the question really about implications, but I think it's worth posing the question at least. That's all I'll say for the moment. I've said too much already, I think.
Does anybody want to comment? Or?
Just one brief thing too, and I wouldn't know even how to begin to address this question, but what sort of also crossed my mind in reading your paper, Geoff, is another sort of discourse in political theory related to political theology about modern sovereignty, also coming from a sort of expression of theological doctrine. And, you know, I guess, you know, is there a relation, or what's the relation, or anyway, it's just, I don't think it's a question that's easily answerable, but it certainly did cross my mind, right? Yeah.
No, that's a great point. And I've seen that somewhat minimally in my exposure to 17th century discussions of Protestant dissenter political thought and sort of the transposition, I suppose, of Calvinist discourses on divine sovereignty into that of the monarchy, sort of before, I guess you could say, the crisis of the Civil Wars. I'm not as familiar with that literature later, but it's a very good question.
Yeah.
I've just written a piece actually about Locke on sovereignty, and really the point is that he avoids the term because he defines it as being all powerful in a way that he thinks can only be divine. This is my argument anyway. And he actually avoids the term when he's talking about politics. I would say precisely because he thinks that if there is some being that is omniscient and omnipotent, you know, it must be God, not man, and therefore the term's inapplicable to politics as normal. So
that's fascinating. Could you send me the reference to that when you get a chance?
Certainly will, yeah.
You know, something else that just occurred to me as you were all speaking, and thinking about this issue of secularization and so forth. I mean, and the different ways of thinking about this shift. The other part, and you mentioned this in your paper, Geoff, was the interiorization, right? That in a way that sort of seeming, that sense of secularization is a kind of shifting of religious focus, at least on the part of elites. And I think that's actually really worth kind of remembering as well, is that this is very much a conversation about elites, is conceiving of faith that is something interior. And so that, and this question of the private, and that actually also leads me, Rebecca, in terms of thinking about your paper, is in thinking about la chose publique is also, I know it's in the realm of the political, but does this kind of discourse start setting up the parameters for thinking about the private as well, and the relationship between the private and the civic, and the private and political order as well? And, you know, partly I should say is my question is in part is, as an 18th century person, of course, I was thinking about Habermas and what Habermas argues.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very good question. And there is definitely some sort of ethos or understanding of some idea of, without, I will inevitably sound Arendtian without wanting to sound Arendtian, but of an idea of a public sphere, right? That seems to be emerging in this initial use of it. I mean, it's funny that it shifts and sort of moves away and becomes more explicitly a sort of regime term by the end of the 17th century, it appears to me. So initially, chose publique was perfectly compatible with monarchy, and then by the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century, chose publique was used as precisely a reference to a republican regime, right?
Mhm.
So it's only in this initial iteration, because of the vagaries and oddities of translation, that you see a sort of emergence of this notion of public and publicity, but not so much in the Habermasian sense, right? Because it's initially not using to reference a space that is more broad than you know, in terms of reading groups. And, you know, Habermas has a sort of broader sense of what the public sphere incorporates, which isn't just
Mhm.
the king or those who are acting in government, right? So, but for Rudé and so on, and Tory, right, the reference is those who are either administrative officials or the king, or those who are acting in some sort of official public position. So so it's a different but maybe nascent kernel of something there. And there certainly is that distinction between shows publiques and shows privées. I mean, the thing that came to my mind, right, when you talked about interiority, that sort of discourse, I think, comes more from, well, partly Protestantism and partly Hellenism, right?
Mhm.
How this shows publiques, shows privées feeds into that, I'm not sure, but yeah.
Well, if nothing else, it's worth kind of thinking about as well.
Could I maybe follow up on that? I think Rebecca's, oh no, you're back. You'd frozen for a moment. Maybe just following up on that. I mean, you say about the reification of La Chose Publique and the notion of stewardship, and you know, and in a way the monarch could be a steward, but then you mention about statesmen, and in a way, you know, that it's kind of lessons for statesmen. How would you characterize the difference between the notion of the state that was in play there and the notion of the public thing? I mean, is
Right. Well, because there's a, yeah, I mean, what, yeah, I mean, I suppose, you know, to do that historically and accurately, one would, I guess, have the notion of l'état. And yeah, I don't have a good sense. I mean, from a political theory perspective, right, one might argue that the notion of the state per se was probably potentially Baudin or Hobbes, right? I'm not sure.
I think we may have lost you.
Yeah.
But if I were to attempt to answer that question, I guess I would suggest that it's, I mean, in the way that, for example, Amiot talked about it in the preface to one of his translations, right? He spoke about La Chose Publique as something that only corresponded to good government, right? And not to Aristotle's three bad governments, right? So our modern notion of the state wouldn't have that normative differentiation, right? So there is something normatively incorporated into that. That's not quite what our contemporary understanding of republicanism is, but there is some sense of public good associated with that, that is distinct from state, which, at least from one perspective, is more it's invoked with the hope that it's more objective, whether it is or not, right? Yeah.
Okay. And would the readership be talked about in terms of la publique, or I mean, I suppose you've got this 17th century thing in Anglophone writing about published to the world, which needn't necessarily mean going into print, but it gradually became
I wouldn't see it, at least in the early days of book publishing in the 16th century. I mean, initially some of these things were translated just for the court, right, and then became printed later. Some of these political treatises, right, and something like Torrey's work. Yeah, I'm not sure how widely disseminated they were, but yeah, I don't.
I suppose I was just thinking about the kind of language that was used when they conceived their audience, but in a sense it would be a limited audience.
The word I see most often is lecteur, the readers. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Geoff Burson, do you want
I actually had a couple of questions that touch on this a little bit. I found it rather interesting that Amiot's translation "chose public" is not regime specific, meaning that we mostly associate that with the Republic. In fact, in English, Republic derives from Res Publica originally anyway, in some fashion. And yet it's not the case. And then looking at 18th century developments with respect to republicanism, I mean, it's been kind of a common trope increasingly that notions of republics as promoting virtue and the commonweal in many ways are themselves regime specific at first. In other words, there's often this notion of reforming monarchy more in line with more functional republic as a regime of promoting virtue. So I wonder if maybe the circa 1570 shift toward chose publique showing up more in reference to republicanism may actually be in some sense embedded, I guess, with the earlier idea of it has something to do with, and I wouldn't know what, but maybe something to do with the fact that chose publique, when it begins, is connected to everything, and more specifically monarchy, and then republic later on becomes more salient, and yet not in a democratic republic specific way or revolutionary republic specific way. I don't know if that makes any sense. So maybe the change is not so much republic specifically, but something else more complicated.
Well, I have to say one thing that occurred to me, again, thinking about these papers together, is in fact the place of religion, not as theology and so forth, but the wars of religion, the conflicts surrounding religion. And I think in some ways, and religious affiliations, that they create, I mean, if you think about it, they destabilize so much and on so many levels. And so what you see with a variety of thinkers and the terminology that they use, again, thinking about the context in which they're operating, that in some ways they're using the kind of traditional terms, but it has different meaning in that context. So Rebecca, thinking about the change, by I think it's 1559, you said? Yeah. And what's taking place in France at that point, and the state of the monarchy at that point. And similarly, Geoff, in a different context, the fact that Locke is, he's a Francophile, but he's looking for these Protestants. He's looking for these people who are somewhat on the edges of French society. And then even that kind of pursuing the query of natural religion, in some ways, is a response to those kinds of conflicts. So I lay that out as another element to consider as well.
That's a good point, and certainly with respect to the 1570s and 80s and that shift toward the association of republicanism with chose publique more explicitly, perhaps in a manner more reminiscent of their first century usage of it, that might be tied to Protestant and Catholic resistance theories and shifts in notions of sovereignty and republicanism in that time period. The religious wars could very well have something to do with it. I had a quick question for Rebecca, if I might, just out of curiosity. You piqued my interest early on when you spoke of the context of the flurry of translations of Plutarch, of which you were focusing on Amio. Was there something contextually in and around the 1530s when Francois I focused on disseminating Plutarch translations? Because in some ways, it's interesting to me how Byzantine diaspora scholars, it almost sounds like, put him onto that, or at least some of the court humorists surrounding him.
Absolutely.
And, yeah.
I think it has a lot to do with Jean Lascaris, who, you know, he was in Florence for a bit, but when he was brought, when the French invaded northern Italy, right? He was brought from northern Italy to France to the court, and Plutarch had been quite popular in Byzantium, and Lascaris was a huge fan, and basically he translated select lives into Latin so that Claude de Seyssel could translate them into the vernacular to give verbally to the court, and to append it to translations of Appian, in part because some of the books were missing, but those lives of Plutarch's carried the historical period that was missing from the original Appian and so on. Anyway, I have a whole analysis of this. Yeah, so I think it has a lot to do with the Byzantine scholar Lascaris as well. I mean, Secundinos had translated the precepts in the earlier century, and then it was picked up by Geoffrey Torrey. Why Geoffrey Torrey picked that up to translate, I think, would be a really good question, and I don't know why. I mean, he's a really fascinating figure. There should be a lot more written about him because he's just really interesting. Yeah, I don't know that question exactly. Yeah, apart from Lascaris certainly encouraged it, but it's hard to think it's solely the responsibility of this one person, right? It has to be a whole confluence of things that led people to be receptive to that as well, right? Yeah.
It is interesting.
I was really struck by the first sentence of your chapter, which is circulated separately, Rebecca, where you say early modern political thinkers often were scholars beyond the writing of political treatises, including translation of classical works. And I suppose that struck me when I was talking about Locke being, in a way, first and foremost a scholar,
Right.
Who did some translation but tended to leave it to others. But just on that, because I don't know, you mentioned about Torrey not much being written about him. So is your aim with the book project to talk about him in terms of being a political thinker in his own right, or is it really that he was a translator and that's where we can discern? I suppose I'm just wondering what is added to the analysis of the translation if we really know who he was, what he did, and what he thought in kind of his own words, as it were.
Right. Well, Torrey is significant for me because of the choice of what he chose to translate, which was a very pragmatic treatise of Plutarch. And so while the English were translating more or less essays on how to be healthy, and how to, how to avoid talking too much and so on, the French were introduced to this Plutarch who was talking about very ways to sort of navigate what is appropriate in the public realm. How are you effective as a leader? And so the argument, it's not that necessarily Torrey was a political thinker, but he put Plutarch into circulation in France to help people think about politics in a certain way that wasn't being generated in the same way in the English context. Anyway.
Okay, well, this is, obviously we could go on for a while, but we do need to wrap it up. And I think there are actually a lot more threads that came out of it, which was really, really great. And hopefully the conversation can continue on some level. So thank you. That was really fun.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mita. And also thank you to H France for allowing us to do this. It's quite an undertaking on their part.
Absolutely. Great thanks to them.
Yeah.